Let's talk actual football. Well, maybe. We might have to go back to the courtroom. But Matt Baker joining us now, Tampa Bay Times. He covers Florida State there for that great newspaper. Hey, Matt, how are you? Welcome to Sports Talk.
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, certainly our pleasure, Matt. We appreciate you spending a couple of minutes with us. So you had a story today that the Atlantic Coast Conference has 7 days to give Florida State copies of its ESPN contracts and related documents under a protective order that was signed today. Explain, if you will, what that means and how does that further Florida State's calls to try and extricate itself from the Atlantic Coast Conference?
So in order for this contract, for this dispute to be resolved, basically there's a whole lot of noise going on here, but here's the thing that really matters. All the sides, Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC, are asking courts to review these documents, the ESPN documents and some related ones, to say what do they mean. Does it mean that we, the schools, can leave for such and such money? Who gets the TV rights if we leave tomorrow? These are the types of things that are going to be that they're asking judges to look at. And now we're in a situation where Florida State is going to get a copy of these documents in the next few days. And I want to be clear, I don't think this was a huge win for Florida State. It really wasn't. It was something that was going to happen in some way, shape, or form anyway. These contracts are vital to the actual heart of the case and what's really going to matter here. So it's just going to be a matter of what were the terms that they could get these? Are they going to be subject to public record or anything like that? How could they disperse this information, use this information? And then when was it going to happen? And we kind of got those answers where it's going to be confidential until a court can kind of weigh in on some of the merits of whether it should be public or not. And they'll get it here in the next few days, and then things can kind of proceed forward and they can start arguing about more important issues.
Matt, Dennis Dodd of CBS tweeted out a little bit earlier this afternoon. He said, always the case in this sort of thing, but rights holders are absolutely rooting for Florida State to stay put. He points out, for one, networks don't want their contracts exposed in current court battles, and secondly, an exit would cause massive upheaval in another reorganization and realignment. Is he onto something there? Do you buy that?
Well, certainly they don't want their contracts exposed. That would be, there's a reason that I guess a couple of weeks ago now, all the other power conferences wrote briefs and one of the many lawsuits going on here say, hey, look, these are trade secrets. If Fox knows what ESPN is doing, then that gives Fox an advantage. If the Big Ten knows what the ACC is doing, then the Big Ten has an advantage. And I don't know, I'm not smart enough to understand all of the details on how much of this stuff really matters, because a lot of this stuff is public anyway. Does it really matter if it's public that ESPN gets such and such suites or such and such access to games to, I don't think anybody cares. I don't think that really matters. But the conferences say it matters, and the networks say it matters. So I think we kind of have to believe them at least to some degree. Because look, this is their business. They're in the business of broadcasting, of getting the rights and then broadcasting those games. And if their stuff is kind of out there, then that can be a competitive advantage or disadvantage for certain leagues and networks. As far as kind of the general unsettlement, yeah, I think if you gave the Big Ten and SEC truth serum, certainly the SEC, they would rather things stay put for a while. Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, has more or less said as such. Like, let's see how this whole 16-team thing, let's see how this works before we think about adding. Maybe there's some just logistical issues or some competitive issues, or maybe there's just stuff that they haven't thought of that happens when you expand as much as they have, and then the Big Ten's that on another level. So I think they would rather see things kind of settle in for a little bit before it all gets blown up.
How much, if any, do you think it was a factor when Florida State went undefeated last year and did not get into the college football playoff, maybe partly in their minds blaming the Atlantic Coast Conference for not being strong enough to give them that bump to get in? Do you think that had anything to do with them ultimately suing the Atlantic Coast Conference, or was this already coming and that was maybe the cherry on top?
I think it's more the cherry on top. Look, go back a year and a half ago is when these conversations first became public. I think it was a February of 2023 Board of Trustees meeting where FSU administrators were starting to say, look, this might not be right. This might not work. And then, 11 months ago, before the season started, Florida State officials were saying, look, something's got to change. It's not a matter, one of the trustees said, it's not a matter of when we leave the ACC. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how. So that was going to happen, I think, anyways. But I do think the playoff snub was a factor. It was the cherry on top. I mean, if you read the lawsuit, and God knows I've read every word of all their amended complaints and all these other briefs and filings, but the introduction, the first part of Florida State's lawsuit against the ACC talks about the playoff snub crystallizing their kind of grievances with the ACC over the years. And I think they might have a small point in there. If the ACC had been better in football, if Virginia Tech hadn't been mediocre, and if the Wake Forest of the world were a little bit better, maybe the strength of schedule would have improved, and maybe Florida State would have gotten in. But there's a reasonable argument against that as well.
Matt Baker joining us here from the Tampa Bay Times. You can read his work at tampabay.com. Matt, we here in South Carolina, we've been looking at it from the Clemson perspective quite a bit, and Clemson has a long, steeped history with the ACC and the North Carolina Tobacco Road schools dating back to 1953. Florida State doesn't have that. For many years, Florida State was a football independent, and they were in the Metro for a bit. So I wonder if there's more of an independent streak among the Florida State faithful, almost as if it's not the ACC, that's okay. We'll join another conference and make more money. Whereas with Clemson, there has to be a bit of an emotional tie. I'd ask, is there any emotion involved with this and leaving the ACC, having been there since the early 90s?
If there's any real emotion, I'm not hearing it, and I'm not, getting that sense from a lot of people. I think this falls into the category of straight cash homie. Florida State was always kind of a weird fit in there because, like you said, I mean, they're not in Tobacco Road, they're not in the Carolinas, they're further away. FSU to me feels more like an SEC school than kind of your traditional ACC school. It's hard to quantify, it's just a feel when you're around it. And they don't have all those decades of tradition the way Clemson does, going back to, like you said, 1953. They've played some schools a lot, but I don't feel like there's a lot of really strong rivalries there. I mean, Clemson's a rivalry, Miami's a rivalry, but those things can continue if Florida State leaves and goes somewhere else, depending on how it all shakes out. But like Florida State and Virginia have a trophy that I did not realize existed until I was doing some homework a few months back. Like, there's that type of stuff. Like, I don't think the casual Florida State fan, if you said, we're never going to play North Carolina State again, we're never going to play Pitt again, I think they'd be like, all right, that's fine. Bring on Oklahoma State, bring on Oklahoma, bring on Michigan State, whoever it is. And that's just, that is a fundamental difference between Clemson and Florida State, just based on where they've been and where they're sitting geographically.
Now, this is, Matt, I'm going to ask you to see around corners here. This is conjecture. We certainly won't hold you to this. But the scenarios, if it does play out that Florida State exits the ACC in the next 2 years, of the scenarios that are in front of them, what's the most plausible? Do you think there were reports that they weren't going to land in the SEC? What about the SEC, Big 10, Big 12, or even some kind of hybrid, like they get Clemson, Georgia Tech, and the Tobacco Road schools and try to siphon them off and form something new and renegotiate with ESPN? Of those scenarios, I know this is a difficult, as I said, seeing around corners, but do you have an inkling as to what might happen here?
My thought has always been the Big Ten is the most likely destination. I think from Florida State's perspective, that would be the preferred destination, but it takes two. Florida State is not in the AAU, which is a group of, I think it's 64 or so prestigious, top-tier research schools. Florida State's not in that, and the Big Ten cares a lot about that. Florida State's a good school. Is it good enough academically to fit in there? I don't know. It's going to be up to the presidents, but we also have to remember the way college sports is going. I think the academic part of this is going to matter less and less in the next couple of years, where I don't know how much that tether to actual school is going to be there. So there's so many moving parts to all of this as it pertains to the Big Ten, as it pertains to the Big 12. Like, does the Big 12 get a lot more money through naming rights, through private equity? Does the SEC say, you know what, we want Florida State and Clemson because we don't want the Big Ten to have a foothold here? Like, there's so many moving parts. I don't think like an independent thing. I don't think that's practical or makes a lot of sense for Florida State. I've certainly heard speculation about kind of reforming the ACC or a scaled down version that gets rid of some of the also-rans. I don't quite understand how that would work and why that would be a good thing. I mean, I certainly don't understand the contractual things that would have to happen for that. So if I were handicapping it right now, if Florida State's leaving, I think the Big Ten is the most likely landing spot. And then, probably SEC and Big 12 after that. But I'm intrigued by this reorganized ACC. I just don't know how it would work.
Couple more minutes with Matt Baker of the Tampa Bay Times. And Matt, upcoming in just over a week or so, the ACC kickoff will take place up in Charlotte. I was telling Smitty earlier in the week, I believe it may be the most attended, and that's not because of SMU and Cal and Stanford and all those teams coming and bringing media. I think it's going to be the most attended one because of all the off-the-field stuff to discuss. Like we're talking tonight, certainly with the rumors about Clemson and Florida State possibly going to the Big 12, the SEC, or the Big 10. How do you think Mike Norvell is going to position himself and handle some of these questions that he's going to have to answer or at least be asked? How will he try and answer them with regards to the lawsuits and possibly moving to another conference?
He'll handle them politely and diplomatically. It's over his pay grade. To some degree, it's over the pay grade of athletics director Michael Alford. These types of decisions are made by trustees, and they're made by university presidents. That's with any realignment thing. The football, I'm sure Mike Norvell would be just, where would you rather be, Mike? I'm sure Florida State people will have that conversation with him, but that's not his. I don't think that's his concern. I don't think he can do much with that. It's going to be up to all the other moving parts. And goodness gracious, Mike's got enough on his plate. He replaces almost every significant player from the team that started 13-0 last year, and he's got a roster that to me is capable of making the playoff and maybe winning a game or two in there as well. So yes, he will get the questions, but I don't think he will have. I don't think he's going to break any sort of news because it's above his pay grade, and he's got enough to worry about.
Speaking of the team, and then we'll let you get out of here, how much of an impact has DJ Uiagalelei made on the program thus far, and maybe how much goodwill did he get in the locker room when he announced earlier this week he declined an invitation to go to ACC kickoffs so some of the players from last year's team could attend in his place?
I remember DJ's first press conference after he got to Tallahassee, and sometimes you can just tell that guy has it. And you know what I'm talking about. He just got his head screwed on, right? You can tell that with certain players, especially quarterbacks. And DJ is one like that. You can tell he's mature. You can tell he's going to be a good leader and has been a good leader. You can tell he's been around the block and he knows what to do and how to act. Does that mean he's going to go out and win the Heisman and Florida State's going to go undefeated and he's going to throw 50 touchdowns and no interceptions? No, it doesn't. But I think that's a heck of a place to start for a quarterback. And that's kind of, to me, where the floor with DJ is. If nothing else, he has brought leadership and experience to a position group that's obviously vital to a program, and that needed, all that stuff after Jordan Travis's departure. And on the field, I think I've come around to that idea because obviously he wasn't great at Clemson. He was fine at Oregon State. But what he does well in terms of just not making a ton of mistakes, not losing games, he's got a really strong arm that can work well with Florida State's got some more speed at receiver than they had last year. You look at his running ability, and with FSU's, their offensive line is going to be really good. Their running backs are going to be great. You can see the blueprint for why FSU wanted DJ. Is it going to work? I don't have any idea, but I can at least understand that a little bit more now than I did in December and January when his name came up, and I was kind of like, really? That's the guy?
Matt Baker, the college and recruiting reporter for the Tampa Bay Times. You can check his stuff out at tampabay.com. Joining us here tonight with the latest on the Florida State side of the lawsuit, along with Clemson against the Atlantic Coast Conference. Matt, we appreciate the time. Certainly hope to see you at ACC kickoff, and we'll maybe be able to get you back on the program when we get closer to that big Clemson-Florida State game midway through the season.
Deal. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Matt. Matt will always fit in here. In his bio, he says that college football falls just behind his love of his son, his wife, and his dog.